what his state of mind was when he heard the news of the Pearl Harbor attack, and it is a typically long and, as I say, Baroque kind of a passage, so I'll just give you the essence of it. And I think, well, here's the essence of it. He says, the United States was in the war up to the neck and into the death, a Churchillian flair there. So we had won after all. England would live. I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. Now, there are a number of interesting things about that short passage. Number one, it's not very accurate, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It's not exactly a falsehood, but it is very misleading in terms of his state of mind at that moment. But secondly, what I want you to note here is that here are two individuals, Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill, locked at this moment, December 1941. The war in Europe is already 2 years plus old. They've been going at each other's throats for those 2 years. Both of them have a deep interest in understanding as well as they can the strategic balance, the strategic situation, and the strategic implications of American belligerency. And at this moment, hearing the news of the Pearl Harbor attack, they make 180-degree different appraisals of what will be the implications of the United States now entering the war. Hitler filled with confidence. This means that the Americans will be out there hounding off after the Japanese and won't bother him in Europe, and Churchill convinced that the American belligerency, something his policies have been seeking for well over a year and a half, would now clinch the British victory. Now we know, again, how this story turns out. Hitler had it wrong and Churchill had it right, but the fact that these two individuals could make such a different appraisal of the implications of America's entry into the war in December of 1941 reminds us how little anyone understood exactly how the United States was going to fight, how big a force it would raise, how it would divide its forces between air, land, and sea, when it would actually put forces into the field, how they would be equipped, so on and so forth. All very difficult to read as of December 1941. All right, two other remarks from the historical record. The next one comes from a letter, a long memorandum actually, that the German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, wrote to his Führer, Adolf Hitler, in mid-December 1941, after Hitler had quite gratuitously declared war on the United States on December 11th, 1941, something Hitler was not required to do by terms of the German-Japanese treaty, but he did it anyway. That's another story in its own right, so I'll just pass over it quickly. In any case, after Germany declared war on the United States, Ribbentrop prepared a memorandum for Hitler in which he tried to reason through what had now changed in the strategic balance and what would be the implications for Germany's war aims, war plans, that the United States was now going to shoulder arms. And here's what he said. This is the essence of what he said. Again, it's a long memorandum, but this is 2 or 3 sentences that I think capture its essence. He said, we have just 1 year to cut Russia off from her military supplies. If we don't, the Germans had invaded Russia in June of 1941. If we don't succeed, and the munitions potential of the United States joins up with the manpower potential of the Russians, the war will enter a phase in which we shall only be able to win it with difficulty. Now, it turns out that was a much shrewder and more accurate appraisal of Germany's new strategic situation than Hitler's outburst on the morning of December 7th reflected. When Hitler said, now we can't lose the war because we have this ally who's never been vanquished. Ribbentrop's saying something very different about how the United States can now add an element, put another element in the scales that we hadn't really anticipated before, and it could prove fatal to us. And that element, you'll notice, is not manpower, it's not soldiers, sailor craft, and so on, it's munitions. All right? Okay. Fourth and final comment from the historical record. And here I'm going to break the time frame of December 1941 for a reason I hope you'll think is legitimate, because this remark actually is dated from September of 1940, but it came from the pen of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Imperial Fleet and the person who was later to be tasked with the job of organizing the Pearl Harbor attack, and 6 months on from that, the attack on Midway, which is the pivotal battle of the Pacific War. So here's what Yamamoto told the prime minister, the last civilian prime minister of Japan before the Tojo military government takes over, Prime Minister Fumimura Konoye. This is September 1940. The U.S.-Japanese relationship is beginning to go seriously south. The Americans are clamping down this embargo of shipment to Japan of strategic material like steel and eventually oil. And Japanese leaders are trying to see into the future. Are we really looking here at a military confrontation or naval confrontation in the United States or what? And Yamamoto, who has studied in the United States and lived in the United States, knew what he was talking about when he talked about American society, wrote his prime minister, as I say, Konoye, about his view of what the future held. And this is September of 1940. This is the guy who plans the Pearl Harbor attack. Okay? He said, "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year." Notice the time frame he nominates is almost identical to Ribbentrop's. I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for a second or third year. I hope, therefore, Mr. Prime Minister, that you will endeavor to avoid a Japanese-American war. Now again, this is a pretty extraordinary document. The guy who's given the job of starting the war 13, 15 months later is advising his government not to have such a war, because the adversary, the United States, given sufficient time, will surely mobilize to a degree that will make Japanese victory impossible. All right, so that's the background as of December 1941. The United States is in the war. And now I want to share with you a little story. I might even call it a parable. I'm going to call a tale of three cities. And if it's just a little story, and if we understand what happens in these three cities, as I'm going to explain it to you, we'll understand American grand strategy, the way the United States intended to fight the war, decided to fight the war, and actually succeeded in fighting the war according to this plan. Something that's given to very few countries in history that fight wars. They get to fight the war they want. That's a pretty unusual development. If you remember, Clausewitz, the great theorist of war, said war has its own grammar, but it has no logic. That once you've unleashed unlimited violence, that's the nature of war. Anything can happen, and it usually does, and or there's another military maxim, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Everything goes haywire from that point. You start improvising. So this is unusual, very unusual in the annals of warfare, that the United States decided to fight a certain kind of war and actually fought that war to a very large degree. Okay, and in fact, in a passage we saw, or heard at least, in the film yesterday, Franklin Roosevelt summed up the essence of this war-fighting doctrine that the United States embraced in World War II, and Ribbentrop recognized it here, as did Yamamoto implicitly, and it's the concept of being the arsenal of democracy. And you'll note when Roosevelt said we shall become the great arsenal of democracy, he did not say we will become the sword of democracy or the shield of democracy. We'll become the arsenal of democracy, the workplace. We'll produce the stuff. But much of the fighting, the implication was, will be left to others, which is in fact what happens. Okay. All right, so let me go through this little tale of three cities. Sometimes I ask, when I talk about this and tell this story, I ask people to guess what are the three cities that, if we understand what happened in those three places, we'll understand the template, the basis of American warfighting doctrine. One of the best guesses I've had in such occasions is, oh, am I messing up your film by leaving the reservation? One of the best guesses I've had is the three cities that sum up the American war effort are Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, which of course are the three principal cities where the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project, went forward. But those are not the cities I'm going to use. And let me say, I've selected these cities. It's my own teaching device. This isn't anything that's written in copper plate somewhere, but this is just a way that I've devised to try to make this accessible to students and others. So the three cities in our little parable are, they're all on rivers, as it happens. It's kind of coincidental, but the first one is Rouen, France, on the Seine River. Our second city is Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River. And our third city is a city that had its name changed 3 times in the course of the 20th century. It began the 20th century known as Tsaritsyn, and is today known by the name of the river on whose banks it sits, Volgograd, on the Volga River. But at the time our story unfolds, it was known as Stalingrad. Okay? And if we understand what happened in these 3 places, we'll understand, I think, what was the nature of America's war-fighting doctrine, war aims in World War II. Okay. And our story unfolds incidentally